I really like that. It is well when it talks about how God has won, Christ prevailed. That is the end of the story. That is it. That is the end of the game. Ball game over. Christ has won. God has won through Christ prevailing on the cross. And this morning we're still in our humdrum series, and I appreciate you guys again weathering the rain. I believe God, or I believe the devil wants to stop everything that we're doing here. He's going to make it rain every week, it seems like. Now, I did notice one thing this week is that this week and last week, that if you got here early enough, you got here before the rain. So I guess God rewards those that are diligent and that get up early at the sunrise to be in the house of the Lord. But I appreciate you guys braving the rain again this morning. Now, if you haven't been here for our Humdrum series, this series is all about the monotony in motion. How, you seem like you go through the same thing over and over, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. It's just kind of the humdrum, You kind of get in that groove, and then all of a sudden life gets a little bit boring. It's not exciting. And we talked about the first week how either you can try to escape it, and that's what a lot of us do is we run away from that humdrum. We try to leave that humdrum. Or we talked about how you can simply endure it. But I don't believe God called us to endure the humdrum. I don't believe He called us to just endure our trials, endure our sufferings. He called us to be victorious in those. And so we talked about how you can either escape it, you can endure it, or the third option is you can actually embrace it. You can enlist it for your good and for God's glory. And we're studying in the book of Ruth, so if you want to go ahead and turn to the book of Ruth, it's a small book in the Old Testament, the book of Ruth. And we haven't even gotten out of the first chapter yet, and there's been so many good things about it. Last week we talked about how good intentions are good for nothing. Good intentions are good for nothing. It doesn't matter what your intentions are. It matters what you do. And this week I want to talk about beating back the bitterness. Beating back the bitterness. How many of you in your life, you don't have to raise your hand, but I just want you to think about either a person, a place, or a time that you have grown bitter towards. I imagine we all have them. You see these people coming and you're like, oh, not them again. That's bitterness. That's what bitterness is. Or you have to go somewhere and it's like, oh, I have to go here again. I really don't want to be there. So I think you can all think of some times, either some times, some people, or some places that you've grown bitterness against. So we're talking about Ruth and we're talking about Naomi. And if you would, go down to verse 19. I'll go ahead and read these couple of verses, and then we'll get into the message. It says in verse 19, so the two women, this is Naomi and Ruth, went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. So the town had seen the strangers coming from way off. And the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? And she answers, she says, don't call me Naomi. She told them, she says, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has inflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So a little bit in the backstory, if you haven't been here, is Elimelech and his wife and two sons went to the land of Moab. Now God had told them to stay out of the land of Moab, but there was a drought in Bethlehem. And so they left Bethlehem and went to find a refuge in Moab, a land that God told them to stay away from. And God had also told them, don't marry someone from Moab. And so what does Elimelech do? He takes his wife Naomi and his two sons, and they go to Moab, and his sons get married, and then Elimelech passes away. And then Naomi's two sons pass away. So I imagine she has a right to be a little bit bitter. She has a right to say, okay, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty, but God had told them to stay away from there. And so she's coming back now, and Ruth, who is her daughter-in-law, a Moabite woman, just refused to leave her. She said, no, I'm going to go with you, Naomi. I'm going to stick it out. I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to go through what you go through. Your God is going to be my God. Your people are going to be my people. Where you die, I'm going to die. And so Ruth is there by her side, but when she comes back, all of a sudden, people see her from afar off. They see these people. They see these two women, and they say, "Can that be Naomi?" She had been gone for 10 years. She had been living in Moab for 10 years, and as she's coming back, the other women see her and say, "Can this be Naomi?" See, I can't help but think sometimes when we live outside of God's will, it kind of changes the way we look. People don't recognize us anymore. When we step outside of God's will, all of a sudden our features, whether it be physical or whether it be internal, whether it be spiritual, how people know us, how we talk, when we live outside of God's will, it kind of changes us a little bit. Sometimes so much so that people don't even recognize us. I mean, we can think about people that pursue drugs and they give their life over to drugs and they're ruled by drugs, and how it changes the way they look. And I'm not just saying drugs is the only way to live outside of God's will, because if you see families where the husband, he tries to escape the humdrum, he tries to run away, and all of a sudden in the family pictures, he doesn't look happy anymore. It's like he's just having to endure the pictures. He doesn't have that. So living out of God's will, sometimes it changes the way that we look. Sometimes you got to go back to where you left God's will. We talked about that last week, how sometimes you have to go back. But I want to ask you this morning, are you living in God's will, or are you living outside? Because if you're living outside of God's will, it's changing you. It's changing who you are. It's changing how you look. It's changing how you address the things. And if you're tired of things not changing, then maybe it's because you've been in Moab too long. If you're tired of the way that you look and the way you approach things, maybe it's because you've been in Moab too long. I want to encourage you this morning, don't stay stuck in Moab. God didn't call us to live in Moab. He called us to live in the promised land. And if you're outside of His will, then you're stuck in Moab. So let's get back to Bethlehem. But I want to say this, and no matter how it's changed you, because it will, sin will change you. Sin has consequences. It will destroy your life. But I want you to hear this morning. Bethlehem is still there. Bethlehem hasn't gone anywhere. You can still go back no matter how long you've been there. Now in verse 22, I just want to give you a little bit of history when it says that her daughter-in-law arriving in Bethlehem at the barley harvest as the barley harvest was beginning. The barley harvest was actually considered a new beginning for the Israelites. Every year when they would have the barley harvest, that was kind of maybe like their New Year's celebration. It's a new year. It's a new beginning. So I think it's kind of interesting that Naomi is coming back with her new beginning, just as the Israelites are experiencing their new beginning. And what God had commanded the people to do is God had commanded the people, He said, listen, as you go out into the barley harvest, as you are harvesting the barley, if you leave some behind or you drop some, He said, don't go back and pick it up. Leave it behind. As you're picking the grapes off the vine and you miss one, don't go back and get it, because what God told him in the book of Leviticus is this. He said, listen, leave those behind so that the foreigners and the widows and the fatherless will have something to eat. And if you're here this morning and you're a widow, or you feel like you're fatherless, you feel like you're an orphan in some way or another, you feel like a foreigner, that's what the church is for. See, we have people give faithfully week in and week out for you. This is why we do this. We don't do it to have a nicer building. We don't do it for things like that. We do it because God commanded us to leave those things behind. God has taken care of our needs. It's a way that we can help support your needs. If you feel like you're a homeless person, like you don't have a place, that's what the church is for. That's what we are for. And so Naomi says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Now the reason why she said call me Mara is because that's what Mara means, is bitterness. Mara means bitterness. Bitterness is a feeling of anger and resentment caused particularly by perceived unfairness and suffering, or by adverse circumstances. Now, I've seen this thing going around on Facebook. I've not participated in this one. I kind of did the the polar plunge, I think, a couple years ago. I don't think I did the ice bucket challenge. But I've seen one going around now called the persimmon challenge. Now, how many of you know what a persimmon is? It's a little fruit off of a tree. Now, persimmons, from what I understand, they're used for cooking and things like that. But if you get a persimmon before it's ripe, it's very bitter. It has a very bitter taste. And I've seen this challenge going around where people are challenging other people on Facebook to eat a unripened persimmon. And obviously, once they put it in their mouth and they take a bite, their face just goes, ooh, that's so gross. That's what bitterness does to you. That's how your face looks when you're a bitter person. You have that sour-looking face. And also, listen, I'm not going to go out and be around an unripened persimmon. I'm not going to go out and intentionally pick up a persimmon and put it in my mouth because of its bitterness. If you're a bitter person, people are going to stay away from you. They're not going to be around bitter people. If you feel like maybe you all alone, you push people away in your life because of your bitterness, they're not going to be around that. And you're going to walk around with a scrunched up face all the time. That's what bitter people look like. And so I want to talk about this morning 3 ways to beat back the bitterness. 3 ways to beat back the bitterness. Number 1 is let the Lord do the labeling. Let the Lord do the labeling. She says, don't call me Naomi, she told him. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I don't know about you, but there's been times in my life where I've wanted to change my name. My name is Michael, okay? That is about the most generic name you can get on the face of this planet. I feel like I have no originality whatsoever. But we're all pretty much stuck with the name that we're given. We're all pretty much stuck with the name that our mother gave us. It goes around with us on our birth certificate. It's on our Social Security cards. It's on our driver's license. It is what it is. You can't change that. And growing up, I always wanted to change my name. I wanted to go by my middle name, which is Brandon. Now, my son is named Brandon now because, I wanted to go by Brandon, so I let him go by Brandon. But my name is Michael. And from 1954 to 1998, Michael was the most popular name given to boys that were born. 1954 to 1998. That's almost as long as the SEC has dominated the college football championship, which is right around the corner if you're a Florida State fan or ACC or Big 12 or Big 10 or anything like that. Except for 1960. In 1960, Michael was actually number 2, which it was ranked number 2 behind David. In 1969, almost 5 out of 100 boys were named Michael. Boys that were born in 1969, 5 out of 100 boys were given the name Michael. Now, currently it ranks number 7 for boys named in 2014. In case you're wondering, the number 1 name in 2014 for boys is Noah. Now, Michael means who is like God. And as I was growing up, I was told that. And in a way, I was kind of proud of that. I would walk around and say, my name means who is like God. Who is like God? Who is like God? But as I got to studying it, it has a question mark behind it. It isn't who is like God, period. It is who is like God, question mark. And what that question mark means is it's kind of a rhetorical question saying, listen, even though Michael, the archangel in the Bible, as powerful as he was, even though he was so powerful, his name means who is like God, because even with his power, he is nothing like God. The answer to the question, who is like God, when you hear the name Michael, it should remind you no one is like God, especially not Michael's usually. Okay, so that's what the name actually means. But I was given that by my mother. I could not choose my name. I did not come out and say, listen, Mama, before you write down on that piece of paper what my name is, this is what I would like to be named. I had a dream a couple months ago that my wife and I had another child. I don't think it was a prophecy or anything like that. But we hadn't picked out a name yet. And it ended up being a baby girl. And so in this dream, I don't know why I was having this dream. So I had gone to get something to lunch, or something for lunch. And when I came back, she said, I've named our daughter. And I said, I didn't think we could agree on a name yet. And she said, well, I went ahead and named it because they brought the piece of paper here. And when I read that name, I was like, I cannot go my whole life calling my baby girl this name. And I don't even remember. It was some kind of Odysseus. I don't even remember. It was some kind of crazy name. And I just remember being so disheartened because my baby girl had this name that I could never, ever call her. But anyways, we're stuck with our names that were given from our mothers. When the Apple Watch was coming out, months before it came out, there was all this speculation. What are they going to call it? Are they going to call it the iWatch? Are they going to call it the iTime? Or are they going to call it, because Apple names all their stuff, iPad, iPhone, iMac, things like that. So there was there was a speculation on what they were going to call it. But no matter how much speculation it was, Apple still got to choose the name of it, and they ended up calling it the Apple Watch. Now, I say that to say this, is that if our mothers have the right to name us, if the maker of a product has the right to name that product, how much more does the Lord have a right to be the one that labels us? We live in a world where we're all labeled by something. We're either labeled by our occupation, by our skin color. We're either labeled by the way that we dress. We're labeled by the way that we look. We're labeled by maybe the fact that we're overrated. We're labeled by the fact that maybe we're not financially as secure as other people. We all have these labels that people put on us. But I want to tell you this morning, it is only God's right to label us. Let's leave the labeling to the Lord. And we're sometimes we're sometimes the worst person at labeling people or labeling ourselves. We label ourselves all the time. It only takes 5 seconds to scroll through Facebook and see people labeling themselves. They say things like, I'm so upset, or my life is so horrible, or I just can't do this anymore. They label themselves, I'm so angry, or I'm so frustrated, or they say that I'm beyond tired. And I read those things and say, listen, it's not your right to label yourself as those things. If God's the one that is giving you this life, if God is our maker, He's the one that has a right to describe us. How many I ams have you used just this week alone? Think about that. I know that I have. At work, I've said things like, I am so sick and tired of having to deal with some of these people. I've said that. And in a way, I'm labeling myself as sick and tired. That's bitterness. That's exactly what it is. When we say things like that, that's bitterness growing in us. It's taking root in us. And we have to stop and realize that God did not label us as sick and tired. He labeled us as victorious. He labeled us with a purpose. And it is His right. In Ephesians 1:11-14, it says, in Him we were also chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of Him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of His will, in order that we, who were the first to put our hope in Christ, might be for the praise of His glory. And you also were included in Christ when you heard the message of truth, the gospel of your salvation. And when you believed, you were marked with Him, you were marked in Him with a seal, the promised Holy Spirit, who is a deposit guaranteeing our inheritance until the redemption of those who are God's possession. You hear that? God's possession, to be the praise of His glory. Don't label yourselves by your condition, by your mood, by your situations. Don't allow other people to label you by what you have to go through. Don't allow other people to label you by your circumstances, by your situations. Don't allow it. It's God's right to label us. And the concrete truth is that you are who God says you are. You are who God says you are. And no one else gets a vote. You are loved by the King. You are a child of God. No one has a right to take away your inheritance in the kingdom of God. No one gets that vote. Don't allow them to label you by your circumstances, by your shortcomings, by your failures. Don't allow yourself to label you. Let's leave the labeling to the Lord. So that's number one, is to let the Lord do the labeling if you want to beat back bitterness. Number 2 is focus on his faithfulness. Focus on his faithfulness. In verse 21, she says, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Lord has brought misfortune upon me. She says she went away full, but God brought her back empty. And I would say this is that, her condition was valid. Her situation, she kind of had a right to be a little bit upset. She had lost her husband. She had lost her 2 sons. She had a right, if anyone else does, to be bitter. When I think about my dad can be a little bit of a bitter man. I think he got a little tired of my kids and the noise that they make and the places that we went to eat and how busy we always were. So he finally said he just wanted to go home. And he could be a little bit of a bitter person. And as we were growing up, we didn't have that real close relationship that fathers and sons should have. But in a way, I've always kind of made an excuse for him because my father has had to bury 5 children. He had 9 children altogether, and he's had to bury 5 children. I can't imagine the pain that he's gone through in his life. I can't imagine having to deal with that. So in a way, I make a little bit of an excuse for him that the reason why we didn't have that close relationship is maybe he was afraid to lose someone else that he loved. Maybe he was afraid to lose. But here's the thing, her life wasn't empty. Her life wasn't empty at all. She was focused on the things that she had lost instead of the things that were right in front of her. She had focused on those things that she didn't have anymore, instead of focusing on what God had brought into her life. When we think about worship, I wonder as we're worshiping, what are you focused on? Are you focused on the musicians? Are you focused on your circumstances? Are you focused on the condition in the room? Are you focused on the rain outside? Are you focused on all the things that you have to go back to? Are you focused on what the people around you are doing? When we have a time of worship, it's not a time to focus on the distractions. It's a time to focus on his faithfulness. That's what worship is we're giving back to him what he is worthy of. And I know in a lot of churches across America, I love our worship. Each Sunday morning, I look forward to it. But I know in churches all across America, they're just going through the motions. They're not focused on his blessings. They're not focused on his faithfulness. They're focused on just doing what they... have you actually read the words to some of the songs that we sing? It is well, it is well, it is well with my soul. God has won, Christ prevailed. When we hear that, we should be standing up shouting. When we see those words on those screens, some of the words that God is able, that God is with us, he will never leave us, he will never forsake us. When we see those things, if we're focused on his faithfulness, I don't know how we can contain our excitement sometimes. So when we're worshiping, focus on his faithfulness. That's exactly what worship is for. Last week my daddy was actually here, and I asked him, I said, how did you like church? How did you like it? He said, well, I was cold in there the whole time. I said, okay, well, trust me, there's been a time in our church where cold would have been a good thing when we're in the middle of summer without an air conditioner. Okay, cold is a good thing. I said, well, what else? How did you, what else did you like? He said, well, that boy on the guitar, he sure could strum that thing. And I said, yeah. I said, well, did you hear anything that we said? But I can't blame him because he's hard of hearing, but we all do it. We sit in church week in and week out, and we don't hear anything. We hear somebody talking, we hear people singing, but we don't know exactly what they're saying. We don't let those things sink in. Now, real quick, I want to go to a story in Exodus that also uses that word Mara, that word Mara that means bitterness. In Exodus chapter 15, the Israelites had basically just been across the Red Sea as they left out of Egypt. And they had seen this miracle that God did in the Red Sea, where he parted the Red Sea and the Israelites walked across. And then as the Egyptians were chasing them to destroy them, he let the waters go. And so he led them into the wilderness by a pillar of cloud. And they've been in the wilderness for 3 days. And in verse 22 of Exodus chapter 15, it says this. It says, then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Marah, because Marah means bitterness. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. There the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. He said, "If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all of his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the disease I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." The Israelites were focused on the wrong thing. See, they were focused on their condition. They were focused on what they didn't have. Again, their condition was valid. They had been in the desert for 3 days, and by then they had used up all of their water. We're going backpacking next weekend, and I really hope that we have plenty of water, because 3 days in the woods without water is a long time. And so they had a valid complaint to say, what are we to drink? But they were focused on their condition. They were focused on the things that they were without. And here's the crazy thing about it. They were being led by a pillar of cloud, which was God's presence. They were being led by God himself, and they were focused on the water, the absence of water. They were focused on the wrong things. And the Bible tells us that the wilderness, God didn't lead them into the wilderness for their salvation. He led them there for their sanctification. Listen, our humdrum, the things that we go through in life, is God's way of sanctifying us. It's God's way of growing us more for his purpose. The difficult times in life weren't there to necessarily bring you to salvation. Listen, if you've called upon the name of God, you're still going to go through hard times. Those hard times, or that humdrum time, that is for your sanctification. That is so he can use you more for his purposes. And here they are in the wilderness, and they're focused on what they don't have, and God's right there in front of them. I can't help but think so many times in the humdrum, how many times God's just right there in front of us, and we can't even see him, and he's right there in front of us. They went 3 days without water. And maybe you've been praying for your child. Maybe you've been praying for your husband. Maybe you've been praying for your family. Maybe you've been praying for a new job and nothing seems to come about. Maybe you're praying for these things that you really do need. Listen, I want to encourage you this morning, don't take your eyes off of his faithfulness. Don't put your eyes on your situation and your condition. Instead, focus on his faithfulness. Are you going to whine and complain, or are you going to call upon God? The Bible says right there, when they went to Moses, he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood, and he threw the wood into the water, and the water became fit to drink. 3 days they could have called on the Lord, but sometimes maybe we try to do it on our own. Maybe we try to dig our own wells. Maybe we try to find our own way when God's saying, listen, I'm right here. When you need something, just call upon me. Just turn it over to me. And he says, listen, he says, pay attention and listen carefully. Now, those two things right there require focus. Listen carefully and pay attention requires focus. I have a couple of 7 and 8-year-olds on my football team that don't know what focus means, that don't know what listen carefully and pay attention. They don't know what that means. And we're just as bad as adults when God's talking to us. He's saying, listen, when you read my word, pay attention. Listen carefully to the promises that are within. It's all about the focus. See, we can know God's name, but not trust him. We can know all about God, but not trust him, because it's all about that focus and where we focus. We got to focus on his faithfulness. Now, I got this little device here. It looks really weird, and I don't even know if I can get out of its case right there. It just came in yesterday, which was perfect timing because I wanted to use it for an illustration, and this is the perfect illustration to use it for. Now, I don't know, have you ever seen a camera that looks like this? Now, that's a weird-looking camera, and this was a Kickstarter program that somebody came out. But this is a different kind of camera. See, normal cameras, they take a picture. But this camera, it actually takes what's called a light field perception or a light field picture. Now, what the difference is on this camera and normal cameras is this thing called depth of field. If you know anything about photography, the thing called have you ever seen a picture where the person in the picture is very clear but their background is blurry? Well, that's called depth of field. If you have a really shallow depth of field, is whatever's right up close to it will be in clear, but what's behind it will be very blurry. Well, what this camera does, this is really neat, is after you take the picture, you can actually change the focal point. So like if I take a picture right now of everybody out there, if I take a picture, maybe I put it in front of the pulpit and I take a picture and a part of the pulpit right here is in it, and then the crowd, the congregation is out there. What I can do after I take this picture on my computer is I can choose where to focus. I can choose where the focal point is. I can choose what's blurred out and what's clear. This thing is called a Lytro, and there's some examples online where you can actually go. If you go to Lytro.com, you can actually see some of the examples of people that have taken pictures with this thing. And you can choose to focus on what's in the foreground, or you can choose to focus on what's in the background. I think we all need a Lytro camera on our eyes and on our faith. Are we going to focus on the foreground? Are we going to focus on our condition, our surrounding? Are we going to focus on God and blur out everything else? Or are we going to focus on everything else and blur out God? If God is right here in front of us and we were to take a picture of him, how many of us would miss God because we're focused on everything else around us? How many of us would miss God because God is blurred out? We don't even know what this guy looks like. He's just kind of blurred out because we're so focused on everything else around us. Are you going to focus? With this camera, you can choose where you focus. In our lives, you can choose where you're going to focus. You can choose to focus on your condition, or you can choose to focus on God's faithfulness. The Israelites had just seen him spread or part the Red Sea. They had just seen it 3 days ago. And now here they are questioning God because they're not focused on his faithfulness. They were focused on their condition. They were focused on the desert. And I want to encourage you this morning that if you're going through hard times, if you're just stuck in the humdrum and you feel like you can't get out of it, change your focus. Focus on his faithfulness. You know, Naomi, she had a couple of things that she could have changed her focus on. She still had life. She still had her life. John Henry Newman said this. He said, "Fear not that your life shall come to an end, but rather that it shall never have a beginning." Naomi was here and she had an opportunity for a new beginning. That's where she could have focused. She could have focused on the opportunity that God was providing. She was surrounded by family and friends again. And now at first she stood isolated. She pushed everybody away. She stood staring at the wall. But then one day she caught a glimpse of the window and she went to look out. And she saw the opportunity, and then finally she opened the door and she walked out. How many of us have God's given us such a great opportunity in our workplaces? In our workplaces where we feel like we just go to kind of get a check so we can pay for our life. Those workplaces are God's opportunity to actually talk about Jesus. Those workplaces are God's opportunity to make a difference in people's lives. In your neighborhood, wherever you live, in your families, that's an opportunity for God's purpose and God's glory. So she had life, she had opportunity. She also had her relationship with her daughter-in-law. And I can't help but think that sometimes our greatest investment is to invest in those around you. Listen, if you're a mama or a daddy or a grandmama or an aunt or an uncle, and you feel like you don't have a lot left to give, maybe it's in your children or your nieces and nephews or your grandchildren. Maybe that's where the investment is. Sometimes our greatest investment is to invest in those around us. So she still had a relationship. And most importantly, she still had God. You know, Jehovah God is mentioned almost 25 times in this short book. He's a chief actor in the story. He's not a side character. As they roll the credits at the end of the movie, it would say starring God. And in our lives, he's not a side actor. He's not an extra, somebody that's in the background. God is a chief actor in our play. Our lives need to star God. He needs to be a main actor in our play. And when he is, we still have God. If we have nothing else, we still have God. If we've lost everything, we still have God. If we feel worthless and nobody else is around, we still have God to call us son, to call us friend. We still have Jesus, Messiah, who knew no sin but became sin for our benefit. With life, opportunity, relationships, and God, we all have some way to focus on his faithfulness. And if we change our focus, we can have that new beginning. And finally, secure the will to give God the will. Now, secure the will. The first will is W-I-L-L. To give God the will, W-H-E-E-L. Secure the will to give God the will. I wrote a short illustration to some of my employees. Will versus want. Let's pretend that you're driving home, and about 5 cars in front of you, Farmer Todd is pulling a bunch of hay bales on his trailer. Well, Farmer Todd forgot to strap the hay bales down. And so as he starts off, all of a sudden the hay bales come rolling off, and it completely blocks the road. And you're sitting there, and man, it's Friday afternoon. It always happens on Friday afternoon when you're just trying to get home for the weekend. And he's devastated. He didn't mean to. He didn't do it on purpose. And he's doing everything that he can to get the hay bales off the road. But you're sitting there, and even though he didn't intentionally do it, it's easy to get frustrated because you want to get home. You want to get past those hay bales, past what's blocking you, so that you can get home. It isn't your fault that you got stuck behind Farmer Todd. It just happened, but at that moment, there is a complete standstill. You're not making it anywhere. And you decide to yourself, okay, I'm going to be calm. You're patiently waiting for things to be cleared up, and you're doing your best not to get frustrated. You think to yourself, well, this is out of my control, so I'm just going to make the best of it. So you call your family, and you let them know that you're going to be a little bit late. But just then, about 3 cars behind you, a man starts yelling out the window and honking and screaming obscenities to Farmer Todd because he wants to get home. He wants to get by this. Farmer Todd is holding him up. His progress is stopped, so he gets very angry and he begins to shout, obscenities to him to get those things out of the way. And then a woman in front of you starts hollering that she really needs to get home and that this situation is just really slowing her down. And just then, a little old lady and a little old man and their grandchildren, they come walking by your car. And they walk right up to Farmer Todd, and together the 5 of them slowly push hay bales by hay bale out of the way. And finally, with the roads cleared up, everyone begins to make progress again. And as you drive by the little family that helped Farmer Todd, it occurs to you, every one of the cars in that line wanted to get home, but only that little family had the will to get home. I think everybody here wants to surrender their life to God. They want God to be the chief actor in their play. They want to call themselves a Christian. They want to call themselves followers of God. But Jesus said this. He said, listen, before you do, you got to count the cost. You got to figure out what it's going to cost you to follow me. See, want only carries you as far as having the desire to succeed. Success doesn't come from want. It comes from the will to make it happen. I think we got a lot of people in America that they want to. But do you have the will to surrender? Because it's not easy. It's not easy turning your life over to God. It's not easy to let him have the reins. It's not easy to let Jesus take the wheel. I know that country song is very popular, Jesus Take the Wheel, but I guarantee you in your hard times, the last thing you actually do is let Jesus take the wheel. In your life, that's one of the hardest things to do is to let go and let Jesus take the wheel. Even though it is one of the most popular Christian songs, even though it's not a Christian song, it's a country song. But people, in churches, they love to hear that song, Jesus Take the Wheel. But not many people do that in their life. We still try to hold the reins. We still try to take control of that situation. I see the bumper sticker, God is my co-pilot, and I think to myself, well, then you're in the wrong seat. If God is your co-pilot, you're in the wrong seat. You need to get out, walk around, let God drive your life. Too many people in this world want to drive their life and let God ride alongside of them. That's not the way it works. We've got to have the will to give God the will. And here's 5 benefits of letting God have the will. He knows where he's going. In this life, he knows the end. He knows your story. He knows your future. You don't. You're just taking it turn by turn. But by letting God drive your life, he knows where he's going. He has no need for GPS. He also takes the scenic route. Listen, when you give your life over to God, you truly surrender it and you say, Jesus, take the wheel of my life. It's a beautiful ride. It might be up and down. It might be around mountains. But have you ever stopped in the mountains and looked out and seen the beautiful scenery? He makes the ride interesting. It's never a dull moment when you're following God. When you surrender your life to God, it's never a boring ride. Number 4 is he gets you there safely. He's our deliverer. He's going to get us there safely. And finally, this is my favorite, he pays for the gas. Listen, the providence of God, when you have need and you surrender your life to God, the Bible says that he knows and he takes care of the flowers and he takes care of the sparrow. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. Man, if you were to ride with somebody, if you were to go on a trip and they said, listen, I know exactly where I'm going. I'm going to take you through the most beautiful country you've ever seen. You'll never get bored on this ride. I promise I'll get you there safely. I can guarantee you that. And I'll pay for the trip the whole way. You would ride with them. You would say, yeah, let's go. But yet in life, when God says that, God promises that to us, we say, yeah, let's go. But once we get on the trip, we say, God, can I drive? And he's like, no, listen, I know where I'm going. I know where I'm taking you. I know what I'm doing. I promise I'm going to get you there safely. I'm not going to let you be destroyed. I'm not going to let you be crushed. I'm not going to let you perish. I promise I'm going to get you there safely. You say, no, God, I think I got this. And then we take wrong turn after wrong turn after wrong turn. But you know what? God's right there. He never leaves us. He never forsakes us. He doesn't get out of the car just because we don't know where we're going. He's waiting. He's waiting for us to say, pull over on the side of the road. He's waiting for us to get out of the car, walk around and say, God, it's your turn to drive. God, I give it up to you. It's your turn to drive. I've gotten us lost. I've gotten us going in the wrong direction. But it's your turn to drive. Again, I say, it's one thing to know God's name. It's one thing to know about God's promises. It's one thing to know that God is our deliverer. It's another thing to trust that. It's another thing to get out of the driver's seat and let God take the wheel. So if you want to beat back the bitterness in your life, you got to let the Lord do the labeling. Don't define yourself as worthless. Don't define yourself as used up, as broken, as good for nothing. Don't let others label you. Then we've got to focus on his faithfulness. Let everything else be blurred out. Let God be the clear picture in our lives. And then finally, we've got to secure the wheel to give God the wheel and let him drive. So with every head bowed and every eye closed, I'm going to pray for just a moment, and then we'll sing a song. And again, during this song, I want to ask you to just focus on his faithfulness. You know, if you don't know the words, just read the words and let them sink in to the truths of these words. But if you're here this morning and maybe you've been driving your car, maybe you've been driving the car of your life, and God's just sitting over there waiting patiently for you to step out of the car. Maybe this morning is a time that you do that during this song. It may be a time for you to say, God, I've been driving, I've gotten us lost. Here's the wheel, God. I surrender my life to you. I'm getting out of the driver's seat, and I'm going to let you take control. And you lead me wherever you need me to go. God, I just thank you for your word this morning. I thank you for the message of Naomi and how she's so much like us, or we're so much like her, that God, in the hard times, we like to blame you for the bitterness. We like to blame you for taking those things away from us, when really we should be pointing the fingers at ourselves. God, I thank you that you're patient with us, that even though we blame you for things that you're doing for our good, even though we get angry when you're doing it for our good, God, we thank you. I just thank you so much that you're patient, that you're forgiving, and that you don't turn your back on us, that you keep there whispering in our ear that you love us and that we can come back home to you. So God, I pray if there's anyone here in this morning, they've gotten their life in a mess and maybe things are caving around about them. Maybe you've been blurry in their focal point. God, I pray this morning that you deal with them. Let the Holy Spirit work on their hearts so that they may focus on you and your faithfulness, so that they may only allow themselves to be labeled by what you call them and no one else. And finally, God, that they surrender their life over to you. It's in Jesus' name that I ask these things. Amen. Let's stand one more time.
When peace attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll,
Whatever your lot is, He's taught us to say,
and whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul.
let's sing it. It is well. If you mean it this morning,
It is well through the storm.
He's holding on to you. He's got you wrapped in His arms.
It is well with my soul.
Sing my sin, oh, the bliss.
My sin, oh, the bliss of His glorious
Not just
love.
part of it, but all of it was nailed to the cross.
Not in part, but the whole.
And you don't have to bear it anymore.
Is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, praise the Lord, oh, my soul. It is well through the storm. I am held. It is well with my soul, and it is well.
Shout it, church.
God has won, Christ prevailed. It is well with my soul.
Finally, and the Lord hates the day.
And Lord, hasten
My
it.
faith will finally be my sight.
My faith shall be sight. And the clouds below back as a scroll,
I can hear it now.
and the trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul.
Can you really mean it this morning?
It is well through the storm. I am held. It is well with Christ prevailed. It is well, it is well with my soul.
It is well with our soul. Give the Lord a hand clap of praise this morning. I hope those words really sunk into your heart this morning. I appreciate you guys being here, and I pray that as you go back into those bitter places in your life, some of you it's just going home. I pray that you'll be able to beat back that bitterness, that you'll let the Lord do the labeling, that you'll focus on His faithfulness, and you'll surrender the throne of your life to Him.